My name is Adalia Vance. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, if you had asked anyone in my family to describe me, they would have smiled politely and said something like, Adalia's sensitive, she means well, which is a very gentle way of saying, Adalia is fragile. Adalia worries too much. Adalia overthinks. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare firm, one of those invisible professions where your job is simply to notice what others overlook. I read the fine print, I track patterns, I document inconsistencies. It's quiet work, methodical, unremarkable from the outside. In my family, I was the dependable one, the one who arrived early to holidays to help set the table, the one who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders, the one who smoothed over awkward silences when politics or money crept into dinner conversations. I was useful, I was steady, and I was profoundly underestimated. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about a dramatic showdown or a screaming match across a candlelit table. There were no broken plates, no doors slammed. It's about something quieter, about the moment you realize that the people who have known you your entire life have quietly rewritten your identity without your consent. About the night I placed a small digital recorder inside my coat pocket before attending our year-end family dinner, and about what I heard when I played it back. What I captured that evening wasn't a joke taken too far. It wasn't drunken exaggeration. It wasn't even a misunderstanding. It was a plan, a coordinated, deliberate plan to have me declared mentally unstable, to get me help, to protect the family, to legally reposition me as someone whose words, objections, and memories could be dismissed as symptoms. It sounds dramatic when I say it plainly like that, but what frightened me most wasn't the content of their conversation. It was the tone, calm, practical, administrative, like they were discussing a necessary repair. This video is the story of how I got there, how subtle dismissals became a narrative, how silence turned into evidence, and how I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a family isn't hatred. It's a consensus. I won't exaggerate, I won't villainize, and I won't pretend I was perfect. I will tell you exactly what happened, how I responded, and what I chose to do next. Because sometimes justice doesn't look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Have you ever had the unsettling feeling that the people closest to you were quietly deciding who you are without ever asking you? If you asked my siblings who I was growing up, they would have said I was the emotional one. Not dramatic, not unstable, just softer. I cried at commercials. I wrote letters instead of texts. I remembered things people wished I'd forget. In a family that prized decisiveness and sharp humor, I was the pause between punchlines. My older brother, Nathan, is a corporate attorney, confident, articulate, always prepared to win the room. My younger sister, Camille, runs a boutique fitness studio and has that magnetic efficiency people mistake for leadership. My parents admire competence above all else. They built their lives from very little, and they believe resilience means never appearing uncertain. And then there was me. I asked questions no one wanted to linger on. I noticed when someone's smile didn't reach their eyes. I remembered offhand promises. I followed up. That made me inconvenienced. Not because I accused anyone of anything. I rarely did. But because I paid attention. And paying attention in a family that prefers momentum can feel like resistance. When I was 12, I pointed out that my father had told my mother two different versions of the same financial story. I wasn't accusing him of lying. I was trying to clarify. The room went quiet. Later, my mother told me gently, Adalia, sometimes it's better not to dwell on details. That became a theme. In college, when I questioned why Nathan borrowed money from our parents but never mentioned repayment, I was told I was fixating. When Camille canceled plans repeatedly, and I finally asked if something was wrong, she laughed and said, You're always imagining tension. I learned quickly that noticing patterns made others uncomfortable, so I adjusted. I became agreeable, helpful, calm. At family gatherings, I set the table while the others debated investments. I refilled wine glasses while they compared professional milestones. I offered neutral observations that couldn't be misinterpreted. I was the reliable middle, the one who would stay after dinner to help clean, the one who could be counted on not to escalate anything. And over time, something subtle happened. My steadiness became fragile in their retelling. If I hesitated before answering a question, it was labeled anxiety. If I requested clarification, it was called overthinking. If I disagreed, it was spiraling. No one said these things with cruelty. That's the part people misunderstand. It was always delivered with concern. Are you okay? You seem stressed. Maybe you're taking this too personally. Concern can be a very efficient way to silence someone, because if you push back, you appear defensive. And defensiveness becomes proof. I wasn't shouting, I wasn't dramatic, I held a stable job, paid my bills, maintained friendships outside the family. But inside the family dynamic, I had been assigned a quieter role, the one who needed reassurance, the one who sometimes misreads things, the one who required patience. And I accepted it for a long time, not because I believed I was unstable, but because harmony felt more important than precision. I told myself it didn't matter if they saw me as slightly delicate. I told myself that love can be imperfect and still be love. What I didn't see yet was that narratives, when repeated often enough, stop being descriptions. They become infrastructure. And once a structure is built around you, once everyone quietly agrees on who you are, it becomes very difficult to step outside of it without shaking the entire house. At that point in my life, I didn't think the house would ever shake. I thought I could remain the steady one, the quiet one, the safe one. I didn't realize they were slowly building something around me, and I certainly didn't realize they were preparing to close the door. Looking back, the first cut wasn't dramatic. It never is. It happened at a Sunday brunch 2 years ago, nothing special, just the four of us, my parents, Nathan, Camille, and me, at my mother's house. Sunlight through lace curtains, coffee cups clinking, the kind of setting that makes everything feel harmless. Nathan was describing the new client. High profile, complicated estate dispute. He spoke with that polished authority he's perfected over the years. Everyone listened closely. At one point, he mentioned a loophole in the guardianship process, how, under certain circumstances, family members could petition the court if someone was deemed unable to manage their own affairs. He said it casually, educational, interesting. Something in me paused. Unable how, I asked. He shrugged. Mental instability, cognitive impairment, documented patterns of irrational behavior. Courts look at consistency. Consistency. It was the way he said it that caught me, calm, measured, like he was reciting from memory. Camille laughed lightly and said, "See, this is why I could never be a lawyer." I'd start thinking everyone's secretly plotting something. Everyone chuckled. I smiled too. But then my mother turned to me and said, almost playfully, "Adalia, don't start overanalyzing. This is just legal talk." I hadn't said anything else. I remember the exact sensation, the subtle shift from participant to subject. I was no longer part of the conversation. I was the fragile variable inside it. I let it go, of course I did. It would have been absurd to press further. But as the morning went on, small things accumulated. When I disagreed with Nathan about a property valuation issue, an area I actually understand because of my compliance work, he tilted his head and said, "You're getting worked up again." I wasn't worked up, my voice was steady. Camille reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We just don't want you stressing yourself out." Stress. It was a gentle word, protective, almost loving, but I hadn't expressed stress. I had expressed disagreement. There's a difference. The rest of brunch continued smoothly. We discussed holiday travel. My mother asked about my workload. My father nodded through most of it. Nothing explosive. But when I drove home, something stayed with me. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't fear. It was a quiet recalibration. I replayed the conversation in my head. Not obsessively, but analytically. I noticed how quickly my questions were reframed as emotional reactions. How disagreement became agitation. How curiosity became overthinking. And I realized something subtle. The family narrative about me had matured. It wasn't just that I was sensitive anymore. Now I was reactive. And that label is more dangerous, because sensitivity invites comfort. Reactivity invites management. At the time, I still believed it was harmless. Families develop shorthand. Roles exaggerate over time. I told myself that's all it was. But I began paying closer attention. Not in a suspicious way, in a documented way. I started noticing phrases, patterns, repetitions. "You seem overwhelmed. You're spiraling. Let's not trigger anything." Always said lightly, always accompanied by a reassuring smile, and always in moments where I had simply offered a perspective that differed from theirs. It was the first small cut, so small that no one else would have seen it, but I felt it, because when someone consistently reframes your calm as instability, they're not just misunderstanding you, they're redefining you. At that point, I still believed I could correct it gently. Clarify over time, stay steady, stay patient. I didn't yet understand that narratives, once shared between multiple people, start reinforcing themselves. And I didn't realize that brunch wasn't random legal trivia. It was a rehearsal. After that brunch, nothing dramatic happened. That's important. There was no single explosion. No defining argument where someone said something so outrageous I could point to it and say, there, that's when it began. Instead, it was repetition. And repetition is what makes something feel normal. A few months later, Camille hosted a small birthday dinner for our father, just immediate family. I arrived with a bottle of wine and a printed photo I'd restored from an old negative. My parents on their honeymoon, standing in front of a lake in northern Michigan. It had taken me hours to clean up the image digitally. When I handed it to him, my father smiled politely. My mother teared up. It was a good moment. Then Nathan glanced at the frame and said, "You've been getting really into these nostalgia projects lately." I nodded. I just like preserving things. Camille chimed in, half joking. It's that hyperfocus thing she does. Hyperfocus. The word slid across the table lightly, almost affectionately. I laughed softly. Or maybe I just enjoy finishing what I start. Nathan smiled, but it wasn't quite a smile. You don't have to defend it. We know you get intense. There it was again. Intensity. I had restored a photograph. And yet somehow the conversation shifted into commentary about my temperament. Later that evening, when I mentioned that I'd been reviewing some discrepancies in a vendor contract at work and flagged potential compliance issues, my mother said, "Just make sure you're not creating problems that aren't there." I paused. It's literally my job to identify problems. Camille reached for her drink. She's just worried you'll stress yourself out again. Again, I tried to recall when I had previously stressed myself out in a way that warranted collective memory. I couldn't think of anything concrete. A few periods of heavy workload, maybe, but nothing extraordinary. Still, the pattern held. Anytime I described thoroughness, they translated it into obsession. Anytime I expressed concern, they translated it into anxiety. Anytime I disagreed, they translated it into escalation. And slowly, I began adjusting in real time. I softened my tone even further. I prefaced opinions with disclaimers. I might be wrong, but I reduced the detail when explaining things. I stopped correcting small inaccuracies, not because I doubted myself, but because I was tired of the microanalysis of my emotional state. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from being continuously interpreted. It's not loud enough to protest. It's not harsh enough to confront. It just accumulates. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I rationalized it. I told myself families exaggerate traits. Nathan is controlling. Camille is dramatic. I'm sensitive. That's how shorthand works. Except theirs never escalated into character assessments. Mine did. At Thanksgiving that year, Nathan made a comment about the housing market. I offered a different perspective based on recent data I'd reviewed. He blinked, leaned back, and said, "Okay, let's not turn this into a spiral." A spiral. I had spoken for less than 30 seconds. My father cleared his throat slightly, the subtle signal to move on. Conversation shifted, and I felt something new. Not anger, not hurt, but distance. Because in that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't responding to what I was saying. They were responding to a version of me they had already agreed upon. The real Adalia, the calm, analytical, measured one, was becoming irrelevant. The imagined Adalia, the anxious, overthinking, potentially unstable one, was easier to manage. And I let it continue, because correcting them every time would have required confrontation. And confrontation would have confirmed their narrative. So I stayed quiet more often, which they interpreted as moodiness, and the loop tightened. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives as concern, repetition, and collective agreement. And by the time you realize you're being gently rewritten, the draft has already circulated. I still believed I could steer it back. I didn't yet understand that they weren't just commenting on my personality. They were stabilizing a storyline, one that would later serve a purpose. There's a moment in every family when you realize you're not just participating in a dynamic, you're performing a role, and the role has already been cast. For me, that realization didn't come with a fight. It came with an email. Nathan had sent out a group message about revisiting our parents' estate planning. It was practical, responsible, necessary even. My parents were in their late 60s. These conversations happen. He suggested we meet after the year-end family dinner to go over some structural updates. Structural. The word lingered. I replied with a few clarifying questions, timelines, documentation, and whether our parents had already consulted someone independently. Neutral questions. Nathan responded quickly. "Let's not overcomplicate it, Adalia. We'll walk you through everything. Walk me through it. Not walk us through it. Not we'll discuss it. Walk me." Camille followed up privately with a text. "Hey, just trust Nathan on this. I know these topics can be overwhelming for you." Overwhelming? I stared at the screen for a long time. Estate planning is not emotionally destabilizing to me. It's paperwork. risk mitigation, structured decision-making. I literally review regulatory compliance documents for a living. But in their mental architecture, I had been assigned something else. I was the one who might get confused, the one who might misinterpret intentions, the one who needed reassurance before information. That was the role, reliable when it came to logistics, setting tables, remembering dates, maintaining emotional temperature, but unreliable when it came to authority. I could organize Thanksgiving seating. I could not question the financial strategy. I began replaying past years through this lens. Every time I offered insight about investments, it was redirected. Every time I asked for transparency about shared expenses, it was softened into concern for my stress levels. Every time I suggested a second opinion, it was framed as distrust born from anxiety. And I saw it clearly for the first time. My utility was welcome. My scrutiny was not. There's a kind of invisibility that feels peaceful, and then there's the kind that feels strategic. This one was strategic, because if you position someone as emotionally delicate, you preemptively weaken their credibility. Not publicly, internally, within the family ecosystem. It wasn't malicious in presentation. No one rolled their eyes at me. No one called me unstable outright. It was subtler than that. When I expressed hesitation, it was reframed as worry. When I asked for details, it was reframed as fixation. When I paused before responding, it was reframed as internal spiraling. I had become the variable they needed to account for, and variables are managed. That night, I stood in my apartment kitchen and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not panic. Recognition. If I continued trying to prove I was stable, reasonable, competent, I would always be reacting to their premise. And their premise was already fixed. The role they assigned me required me to either perform fragility or exhaust myself, resisting it. There was a third option. Step outside the performance entirely. Say less, observe more. Not to trap them, not to retaliate, but to understand the structure they were building and why. Because roles aren't created in a vacuum. They serve a function, and I was beginning to suspect that my assigned role served something larger than family shorthand. It served control. I didn't know yet how far that control extended, but I knew this. If they believed I was the least stable person in the room, they would eventually make decisions accordingly. And I needed to know what those decisions might be, so I stopped trying to adjust their perception. And I started adjusting my position, quietly, deliberately, without announcing it. They still believed I was playing the same role. They didn't realize I had stepped out of it. The shift didn't happen at a dinner table. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, reviewing a routine compliance audit. Vendor contracts, disclosure forms, internal documentation. The kind of quiet, meticulous task that most people find tedious. I find it clarifying. About halfway through a report, I noticed something small, a pattern in language. 3 separate documents, submitted by different departments, used nearly identical phrasing to describe a risk mitigation clause. The wording wasn't wrong, it was just coordinated, too coordinated. It suggested pre-alignment, not illegal, not dramatic, but intentional. I leaned back in my chair and felt that familiar internal click. The one I felt since childhood when something doesn't quite add up. Consistency, my brother had said at brunch. Courts look at consistency. I stared at the documents again. Patterns are powerful because they create credibility. When multiple sources repeat the same framing, it begins to feel objective, stable, verified, even if it started as a shared narrative. That's when something uncomfortable settled into place. In my family, I was the pattern, the consistent descriptor, the repeated adjective, the gently reinforced storyline. Sensitive, overthinking, spiraling. If 3 people describe you the same way often enough, it stops sounding like opinion. It starts sounding like an assessment, and assessments can be documented. That afternoon, instead of feeling anxious, I felt clear. I opened a new document on my computer, not work-related, personal. At the top, I typed a date. Then I began writing, not emotionally, not defensively, just factually. Brunch, guardianship conversation. Labeled reactive. Father's birthday, hyper-focus comment. Thanksgiving, spiral comment. Estate email, overwhelming. No interpretation, just timestamps and phrasing. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about preserving accuracy. Because memory, when challenged by a group, can start to wobble. And I didn't want mine to wobble. That was the shift. Not fear, not confrontation, documentation. I stopped trying to gently correct them in real time. I stopped softening my tone to preempt their reactions. Instead, I observed, when Camille said, "We just don't want you getting triggered," I didn't argue that I wasn't triggered. I wrote it down later. When Nathan said, "Let's keep this rational," After I asked for clarification on a minor financial detail, I noted the phrasing. Rational, implying what exactly? The shift wasn't visible to them. On the surface, I seemed even calmer, less reactive, quieter during debates, more agreeable when plans were proposed. They interpreted it as an improvement. I interpreted it as data collection. There's something profoundly stabilizing about choosing silence intentionally. Before, my quietness had been an accommodation. Now it was a strategy, not to trap anyone, but to understand the architecture forming around me. Because once you recognize a narrative forming, you have two options: interrupt it emotionally or map it structurally. I chose structure, and with that choice came an unsettling clarity. If they were casually rehearsing a version of me as unstable, then at some point, that narrative might be used. Not in a dramatic way, in a procedural one. The realization didn't make me panic. It made me precise. I began reviewing my own life the way I review contracts. Financial independence, intact. Medical records, clean. Employment history, consistent. Social relationships are stable. If someone ever tried to question my competence, the facts would not support it. But facts only matter if they're preserved. That Tuesday afternoon, something inside me settled into place. I wasn't the fragile one in the room. I was the observant one. And observant people don't need to raise their voices. They need to pay attention. From that point forward, my silence was no longer compliance. It was preparation. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive. I stayed quiet to avoid escalating things. I softened myself to maintain harmony. Now my silence was deliberate. There's a difference. When you're reacting, you're adjusting to someone else's rhythm. When you're choosing silence, you're setting your own. At the next family dinner, I tested it. Not in a manipulative way, just observational. Nathan brought up a recent legal case involving contested conservatorship. He spoke confidently about how families sometimes need to step in when someone is making questionable decisions. In the past, I would have asked clarifying questions, pressed for nuance, explored ethical gray areas. This time I simply listened. I maintained eye contact, nodded once, no counterpoints, no skepticism. Camille glanced at me briefly, as if waiting for me to interject. I didn't. A subtle flicker crossed her face. Confusion, disappointment? I couldn't tell. Nathan continued speaking, but something was different. Without my questions, his monologue felt less like a debate and more like a justification. He over-explained, repeated himself, emphasized how courts don't act without strong evidence. Evidence. I sipped my water, said nothing. Later, when my mother mentioned that I'd seemed much calmer lately, I smiled gently and said, "I'm just listening more." She looked relieved. Relief is informative. It meant my prior engagement had been categorized as agitation. The less I pushed back, the more comfortable they became. Silence in their interpretation equaled stability, which revealed something critical. Their assessment of my mental state was not based on behavior. It was based on compliance. As long as I didn't question them, I was well. That realization was colder than I expected, because it meant the metric for my sanity wasn't emotional regulation. It was alignment. And alignment can be manufactured. Over the following weeks, I refined the approach. When financial topics surfaced, I asked neutral logistical questions instead of challenging assumptions. When Camille joked about my overthinking tendencies, I responded with mild humor rather than correction. When Nathan used phrases like, "You don't want to spiral," I tilted my head slightly and said, "Noted." The less I resisted, the more confident they grew. They began discussing sensitive topics more openly in my presence: property transfers, medical directives, guardianship thresholds. Not because they trusted me more, but because they believed I was less of a threat. That's the paradox of quiet dominance. When you stop fighting for recognition, people underestimate you further. And in that underestimation, they reveal themselves. I didn't record anything yet. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was mapping comfort zones. Who spoke most when I was quiet? Who initiated reframing language? Who deferred to whom when decisions were mentioned? Patterns emerged. Nathan introduced procedural language. Camille reinforced emotional framing. My mother softened everything into concern. My father rarely contradicted the dominant tone. It wasn't a conspiracy in the theatrical sense. It was alignment. And alignment doesn't require secret meetings. It requires shared belief. By remaining calm, by appearing less intense, I gave them space to speak freely. And in that space, their narrative solidified. One evening, as I was leaving my parents' house, my mother hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "I'm glad you're doing better." Doing better. I hadn't changed internally. I had changed strategically. They mistook my silence for healing. They didn't realize it was an analysis. And in that miscalculation, they gave me something invaluable: unfiltered access. I was no longer the volatile variable. I was background noise. And background noise hears everything. When people believe you're no longer a problem, they relax. And when they relax, they stop editing themselves. That's what they never noticed. My quiet wasn't emptiness, it was storage. I began preparing in ways that would have looked mundane from the outside. First, I organized my own life with clinical precision. I scheduled a full physical and psychological evaluation, not because I doubted myself, but because documentation matters. I requested complete copies of my medical records. Clean history, no flags, no prescriptions beyond routine care. I updated my employment file at work, ensuring my performance reviews were formally archived and accessible. 5 consecutive years of exceeds expectations. No disciplinary notes, no behavioral concerns. Then I met with a financial advisor, not connected to my family, to review my assets and create a clearly documented, independent financial plan. Stability isn't just lived, it's recorded. None of this was dramatic, none of it required secrecy, but it created something powerful, a paper trail of competence. At the same time, I refined my observational notes. I didn't write emotional commentary. I wrote transcripts, direct quotes, dates, context. I noted when Nathan referenced legal thresholds for incompetence. I noted when Camille suggested I take a break from stressful decisions. I noted when my mother mentioned that sometimes people don't see their own decline. Decline, that word stayed with me. It implied a trajectory. I also began reviewing public legal information on guardianship and involuntary commitment. Not obsessively, not late into the night. Methodically, the way I would research compliance statutes. What qualifies? What documentation is required? Who initiates petitions? How credibility is evaluated? And one thing became clear: courts rely heavily on consistent testimony from close relatives. Consistency again. 3 voices repeating the same concern can outweigh 1 voice defending itself. That realization wasn't frightening, it was clarifying, because it meant that if a narrative about my instability ever reached a formal setting, it would not begin there. It would begin long before, in casual comments, in repeated adjectives, in concerned tones at dinner tables. The case would be built socially before it was built legally. That's when I made a quiet decision. At the upcoming year-end family dinner, the one Nathan had suggested for reviewing structural updates, I would bring a recorder, not to provoke, not to entrap, to preserve accuracy. If nothing happened, the file would be deleted. If something did happen, I would not rely on memory alone. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's insurance. They never noticed any of this. To them, I seemed softer, less argumentative, more stable. Camille even commented one evening, "You're finally trusting us more." I nodded gently. Trust is an interesting word. What I was doing wasn't trustworthy. It was verification. And verification requires patience. A week before the dinner, Nathan sent another email outlining agenda items: estate adjustments, medical proxy updates, long-term care contingencies. He attached a preliminary draft. My name appeared in a section labeled Contingent Review. I read it 3 times. The language was careful, neutral. It stated that if concerns arose regarding my ability to manage personal affairs, temporary oversight could be considered for my protection. For my protection. It wasn't activated, it wasn't formal, but it existed. A placeholder, an option, and suddenly the years of reframing, sensitive, reactive, spiraling, felt less abstract. Narratives don't exist for entertainment. They exist to justify action. The night of the dinner, I placed a small digital recorder inside the inner pocket of my coat. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt steady. Whatever they discussed that evening, I would not allow it to be rewritten later. They believed I was background noise. They believed I was recovering. They believed I wasn't paying attention anymore. What they never noticed was this: I had never been more present. The year-end dinner looked like every other year. Candles, polished silverware, Camille's carefully arranged centerpiece. My mother's familiar holiday dishes are placed in their predictable order. Normalcy is one of the most convincing disguises. I arrived early, as usual, helped set the table, hung my coat carefully over the back of a dining chair, inner pocket facing inward, recorder already on. A small red light blinked once, then went dark. Recording. No one noticed. Dinner began with harmless conversation. Work updates, travel plans, a brief discussion about rising interest rates. I participated lightly, calm, agreeable. If anything, I was quieter than ever. Nathan seemed relaxed, Camille animated. My parents are comfortable. Halfway through the meal, Nathan cleared his throat gently. "So," he said, folding his hands together, We should probably talk about long-term planning while we're all here. There it was. The tone shifted, not tense, just procedural. My father nodded. My mother glanced at me briefly before looking down at her plate. Nathan began outlining estate adjustments, power of attorney updates, medical proxy considerations. His language was precise, but accessible, rehearsed. I listened. Then he said almost seamlessly, "One thing we've discussed privately is making sure everyone is protected in case someone isn't in the best position to make decisions for themselves." Camille added softly, "Just as a safeguard." I kept my posture neutral. Nathan continued, "We've all noticed that stress has been hitting you harder the last couple of years, Adalia. And we don't want anything to spiral if something unexpected happens." Spiral again. My mother reached for my hand. "Sweetheart, this isn't an accusation. It's just planning." Planning? I asked one question, calmly. "What specific behaviors are you referencing?" There was a brief pause, not long, but long enough. Camille answered first. "You've seemed overwhelmed, fixated on things, distant sometimes." Nathan nodded. "It's about patterns. Consistency matters in these cases." Consistency. I felt something inside me go completely still. They weren't improvising, they were aligning. My father finally spoke. "We just want to be proactive." Proactive. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "I understand wanting safeguards. I'd like documentation of any concerns you have, so I can address them directly." Nathan smiled thinly. "See? That's what I mean. You're already escalating." Escalating. The room tilted, not emotionally, but structurally. Every calm clarification I offered was reframed as agitation. Every request for specificity became defensiveness. And then Camille said the sentence that changed everything. "We've actually spoken to someone about options. Just informational, nothing filed." The air felt thinner. Nathan added quickly, "It's just a preliminary consultation, in case intervention is ever needed." Intervention. My mother squeezed my hand again. "It's because we love you." That was the moment. Not to mention consultation, not the legal phrasing. The collective certainty. They believed this narrative, not as manipulation, as truth. I nodded once at "Thank you for telling me," and then I went back to eating. The conversation moved on, awkwardly at first, then gradually back to logistics and travel plans. No shouting, no dramatic exits. Inside my coat pocket, the recorder captured everything: tone, timing, alignment. Later that night, in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and pressed play. Hearing it back was different from living it. The calmness, the coordinated language, the subtle reinforcements. It wasn't emotional chaos. It was an administrative erasure. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to reposition me, legally, structurally, permanently if necessary. And because I had the recording, something shifted inside me again. Not fear, certainty. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't escalating. I was being methodically reframed. The leverage wasn't explosive. It wasn't blackmail. It was clarity. I now possessed an unedited record of their intent. Proof that the narrative began socially, not clinically. Proof that concern had been coordinated before any professional evaluation. Proof that protection had been discussed without my knowledge. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aware. Because once you hear your own family calmly discussing the conditions under which you might be declared incompetent, there's no one hearing it. And once you have proof, you have a decision to make. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was panicking, because I was thinking. The recording sat on my kitchen table like an object with weight. Not dramatic, not glowing, just present. I played it twice more, not obsessively, but analytically. I listened for tone shifts, interruptions, contradictions. There weren't any. That was what unsettled me most. They were aligned. No one hesitated. No one pushed back. No one said, "Maybe we're overreacting." It was a clean narrative. Concern, patterns, protection, intervention. And now I had evidence that the idea of intervention did not originate from a medical professional observing my behavior. It originated at the dinner table. I had 3 options. The first was confrontation. I could send them the audio file, force them to hear themselves, demand accountability, but confrontation would escalate the story exactly as they had framed it. Emotional reaction, instability, defensiveness. The second option was appeasement. Agree to evaluations, volunteer therapy sessions, perform compliance so thoroughly that their narrative dissolved. But that would validate their premise, that something was wrong to begin with. The third option was quieter, structural. If they were preparing procedural pathways in case intervention was needed, then I needed my own procedural safeguards. Not against them as villains, against the system that allows narratives to become documentation. I opened my laptop and began researching something specific: preemptive legal declarations. There are documents a competent adult can file, affirming mental fitness, appointing independent medical proxies, and establishing clear directives regarding guardianship challenges. You can create protective layers before someone else attempts to. It's not dramatic, it's administrative. The more I read, the clearer it became. If I waited for them to escalate formally, I would be reacting. If I moved first, I would be positioning. This was the irreversible choice, not revenge. Preemption. Once I put legal safeguards in place, independent medical assessments, notarized directives, third-party witnesses, the dynamic would shift permanently. They would either have to abandon the narrative or escalate publicly. An escalation would require evidence they did not have. I sat very still and asked myself one final question. Am I doing this out of fear? The answer surprised me. No, I was doing it out of clarity, because the recording wasn't hysterical, it wasn't malicious, it was organized. An organized concern can become organized action. By sunrise, my decision was made. I would not send the audio, I would not accuse, I would not argue. I would act, quietly, irreversibly, and I would not inform them until the structure was complete. Sometimes, power isn't in raising your voice. It's in filing paperwork no one knows exists. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with an attorney, one completely unconnected to my family. I didn't feel dramatic walking into that office. I felt composed, because the most dangerous position to be in is the one where others are preparing contingency plans for you, and you're unaware. I was no longer unaware, and that meant the next move was mine. The attorney's office was unremarkable. Neutral carpeting, diplomas arranged in symmetrical frames, a small fountain in the corner meant to suggest calm. I appreciated the ordinariness of it. I wasn't there for drama, I was there for structure. Her name was Elise Harper. Mid-40s, direct eye contact. Efficient but not rushed. She asked clear questions and waited for full answers. I didn't begin with the recording, I began with facts. My family has discussed pursuing guardianship in the future, under the premise of mental instability, I said evenly. There is no medical basis for this. I would like to proactively protect my legal autonomy. She didn't react with alarm. She didn't dismiss me either. She asked, has any petition been filed? No. Have you ever been involuntarily evaluated? No. Do you have documentation of your mental fitness? I can obtain it. She nodded once. Good. Then we build a wall before anyone tries to open a gate. I appreciated that phrasing. Over the next 2 weeks, I completed 3 independent psychological evaluations, scheduled by me, paid by me, with clinicians who had no connection to my family. Comprehensive assessments, written reports, clear conclusions, cognitively intact, emotionally stable, no evidence of delusional thinking or impaired judgment. I filed them. Next, I executed a durable power of attorney designating a trusted colleague, not family, as my medical and financial proxy if I were ever genuinely incapacitated. Someone objective, someone who understood documentation. We added a clause requiring independent medical verification from 2 licensed professionals before any guardianship challenge could proceed. Layer after layer after layer. None of it was aggressive. It was preventative. At work, I requested updated performance letters from my supervisor, standard documentation for future advancement. Strong endorsements, specific examples of judgment and leadership. Filed. I organized my finances with meticulous transparency, clear account statements, automated bill payments, asset inventory. Filed. If anyone ever attempted to present a case that I was incapable of managing my affairs, the counter evidence would not be emotional. It would be overwhelming. And the entire time, my family noticed nothing. We attended another small gathering during that period. Camille commented again on how centered I seemed lately. Nathan said almost approvingly, "This is good, this is healthy." Healthy in their definition meant compliant. They had no idea I had just signed documents that would legally complicate any attempt to sideline me. Silence is powerful when paired with action, because while they were still discussing hypotheticals, I was formalizing protections. The most important step came quietly. At Elisa's suggestion, I created a sealed affidavit, time-stamped and notarized, detailing the dinner conversation, the prior pattern of reframing language, and the existence of the audio recording. The file itself remained private, but its existence was legally acknowledged. If anything escalated, the timeline would already exist. That was the pivot point, not when I recorded them, not when I heard the playback, but when I realized I no longer needed to fear their alignment, because I had my own, legal, medical, professional, aligned with facts. The final document was filed on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I walked out of the courthouse feeling neither victorious nor wounded, just anchored. They still believed they were managing a delicate variable. They didn't realize the variable had become fixed. And once a structure like that is in place, the next shift doesn't happen immediately. It happens slowly, subtly, until one day, the people who thought they held contingency plans begin to feel something else entirely. Loss of leverage. They just don't know it yet. The first shift wasn't loud. It never is. It arrived in confusion. A few weeks after I finalized everything, Nathan sent another group email about reviewing updated estate drafts. His tone was efficient, as always. Attached documents, suggested revisions, a proposed timeline. But this time, I replied differently, not emotionally, formally. I've completed an independent review of my legal and medical standing, I wrote. I've also executed my own durable directives. For clarity and transparency, I'm attaching a summary of those safeguards. I'm open to discussing coordination, but I won't participate in contingency structures that assume incapacity without documented clinical cause. I didn't attach the recording. I attached proof of stability, independent psychological evaluations, power of attorney designation, formal affidavit acknowledgement, clean, structured, calm. The response was delayed. That alone was new. Nathan typically replied within minutes. Instead, there was silence for nearly 6 hours. Then Camille texted privately, "Why are you making this so official?" Official. Because you were. I didn't write that. I responded, I prefer clarity. Another long pause. Later that evening, Nathan finally replied to the group email. His tone had shifted, less instructional, more cautious. Noted, we can revisit the structure in light of this. In light of this, the following Sunday, my mother called me. Her voice carried a softness that bordered on uncertainty. "We didn't mean for you to feel attacked," she said. I didn't feel attacked, I answered truthfully. I felt repositioned. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked carefully, "Why would you think we'd try to take control?" I didn't mention the recording. I simply said, but because it was discussed. Silence again. Not denial. Processing. Here's what changed in the weeks that followed. The casual language stopped. No more spiraling jokes. No more references to overwhelm. No more gentle commentary about my stress levels. It was as if someone had quietly removed a script from circulation. At dinner, Nathan no longer framed disagreements as emotional. He addressed them substantively. Camille stopped using therapeutic language casually. My mother stopped preemptively soothing me. They weren't apologizing. They were recalibrating. Because for the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. Not publicly, procedurally. They now knew that if they attempted to formalize concerns, there would be documented resistance backed by professional evaluation. The contingency plan they had quietly prepared no longer rested on solid ground, and something else surfaced. Something subtle but unmistakable. Distance, not hostility, but a new awareness. When I entered a room, conversations paused, not because they were hiding something, but because they were adjusting, measuring. They no longer saw me as the fragile variable. They saw me as informed, and informed people cannot be quietly repositioned. One evening, Nathan attempted a light joke about me lawyering up. I smiled gently and said, "Preparation isn't aggression." He didn't laugh. That's when I knew. The consequences had begun. Not explosive consequences. Structural ones. The assumption that I could be managed had dissolved. And once that assumption disappears, relationships must renegotiate themselves. Some adapt, some fracture. We were somewhere in between. They hadn't escalated, but they also hadn't fully confronted what they'd been preparing to do. And the longer silence stretched, the clearer it became. They had underestimated me, not emotionally, procedurally. And that miscalculation was irreversible, because once someone demonstrates they are capable of protecting themselves quietly and competently, you can never again pretend they're fragile. There's a particular kind of tension that enters a room when something has been exposed, but not fully named. That's where we lived for the next month. No one brought up guardianship again. No one referenced intervention. The language had vanished as if it had never existed. But absence can be louder than accusation. At our next family gathering, I noticed how careful everyone was. Nathan asked for my opinion directly when financial topics surfaced. Not performative, measured. Camille didn't interrupt me once. My mother watched me with something close to uncertainty. It looked like respect, but it felt like recalibration. Because they now understood something essential. I had anticipated them. I hadn't reacted emotionally. I hadn't accused. I hadn't created a scene. I had quietly built safeguards that neutralized their leverage before they ever attempted to use it. And that realization unsettled them more than anger would have. A week later, Camille asked to meet for coffee. We sat by the window of a small cafe downtown. She stirred her drink longer than necessary before speaking. "You didn't have to go that far," she said finally. Go how far? I asked. With lawyers, evaluations, formal documents? Her voice wasn't defensive, it was uneasy. I looked at her calmly. You consulted someone about intervention. That was just informational. So was mine. She blinked. The symmetry landed. That's different, she said softly. Why? She didn't answer. Because what she meant was this. They had expected to control the narrative privately. They had not expected me to formalize resistance publicly, even if only within legal channels. Their plan had been precautionary, quiet. Mine had been preventative, concrete. And once paperwork exists, you can't unfile it. A few days after that, Nathan called. He skipped pleasantries. You made us look like we were planning something malicious. I made myself legally secure, I replied. That implies distrust. Consulting about intervention implied the same. There was a long pause. He exhaled sharply, not angry, frustrated. We were trying to protect the family. From what? I asked gently. Silence again. Because there was no incident, no breakdown, no financial recklessness, no medical emergency, only a narrative. And now that narrative had been structurally challenged. The hardest part for them wasn't that I had protected myself. It was that I had done it without their permission, without asking for reassurance, without appearing unstable in the process. The role they assigned me, fragile, reactive, spiraling, no longer fit. And once a role collapses, the entire dynamic must adjust. That adjustment is uncomfortable because it forces reflection. Over the next few weeks, something subtle shifted in my parents, especially. My mother became quieter. My father is more deliberate when speaking to me. It wasn't an apology. It was recognition. They had participated in a consensus, and that consensus had almost crossed into action. Now it couldn't, not without undeniable evidence. And that evidence did not exist. Too late to fix it doesn't mean we stopped speaking. It means the illusion was gone. They could no longer pretend their concern had been harmless. And I could no longer pretend it had been accidental. The bridge hadn't burned, but it had been reinforced, with boundaries that would never again be invisible. And once boundaries are visible, you cannot return to casual assumptions. The next step wasn't escalation. It was a confrontation. Without heat, without drama, just clarity. Because some conversations don't need raised voices. They need steady ones. The confrontation didn't happen on a holiday. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon in my parents' living room. No candles, no audience, just the four of us. I asked for the meeting, calmly, not to accuse, not to threaten, to name what had already shifted. We sat in a loose square, Nathan in the armchair, Camille beside my mother on the sofa, my father standing briefly before settling into his usual seat by the window. No one looked hostile, just careful. I began simply. I want to clarify something, I said, not emotionally, structurally. Nathan folded his hands. Camille crossed her legs. My mother held a tissue she didn't need yet. You discussed intervention, I continued. You consulted someone. You aligned language over time that framed me as unstable. Whether intentional or not, that narrative positioned me as someone whose autonomy could be questioned. No one interrupted. I responded procedurally, I said. Not to punish you, to ensure my agency wasn't dependent on perception. Nathan spoke first. We were concerned. I understand that's how you experienced it, I replied. Camille's voice was softer. You have seemed distant. Distance is not incapacity, I said evenly. That landed. My father cleared his throat. No one was trying to erase you. I held his gaze. The structure you were considering would have done exactly that. Silence. Not defensive silence. Processing silence. I didn't play the recording. I didn't need to. Because confrontation isn't about proving what happened. It's about refusing to participate in distortion. I'm not angry, I continued. But I won't live inside a narrative that frames my clarity as instability. If I question something, it's because I'm thinking, not spiraling. Camille looked down. Nathan leaned back, tension visible but contained. My mother finally spoke. We thought you were struggling. With what? I asked gently. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because there was no event, no crisis, only interpretation. I softened my tone not to appease but to anchor. If I ever struggle, I will address it directly. But concern should lead to conversation, not contingency planning. Nathan exhaled. It escalated further than it should have. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I would receive. And it was enough. Because what mattered wasn't an apology. It was recognition. Recognition that the narrative had moved beyond teasing, beyond shorthand, into potential action. I'm not withdrawing from this family, I said quietly. But I am withdrawing from that storyline. No one argued. For the first time in years, there was no reframing of my tone. No commentary on my emotional state. No suggestion that I was escalating. Just listening. The conversation ended without raised voices. without dramatic reconciliation. We stood, hugged briefly. It wasn't warm, it was honest. And honesty, when it arrives without heat, has a different weight. On my drive home, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, relief. Because the confrontation hadn't been about proving sanity, it had been about asserting authorship. Of my identity, of my narrative, of my agency. And once you assert that calmly, there's very little left for others to reinterpret. The next chapter wasn't about defense anymore. It was about definition. Who I am now, without their projection layered over it. It's been a year since that conversation. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No estrangement, no public fallout, no family fracture that outsiders would recognize. From the outside, we look the same. Holiday dinners, group photos, occasional disagreements about politics or travel plans. But the structure underneath has changed, and so have I. For most of my life, I believed strength meant endurance, absorbing misinterpretation, staying steady while others projected, choosing harmony over correction. I thought if I was calm enough, reasonable enough, patient enough, eventually the narrative would soften on its own. It doesn't. Narratives don't dissolve because you tolerate them. They dissolve when you refuse to participate in them. I no longer rush to fill silences at dinner. I no longer preface my thoughts with disclaimers. If I disagree, I state it once clearly, not defensively, not forcefully, just directly. And something interesting has happened. No one calls it spiraling anymore. No one suggests I'm overwhelmed when I ask precise questions. They respond to the content now, not the tone they once assigned to me. The difference isn't that they suddenly changed personalities. It's because I changed posture. I don't monitor the room the way I used to. I don't anticipate being reframed. Because if it happens, I address it in the moment, briefly, calmly, without escalation. I'm not escalating, I'm clarifying. That sentence alone has shifted more than any argument ever could. The recording still exists, sealed, unused, not as leverage, as documentation. I've never played it for them. I don't need to. Its purpose was never exposure. It was validation. It reminded me that my perception was intact, that consensus doesn't equal truth, that calm people can still be systematically rewritten if they aren't attentive. The biggest change, though, isn't in them. It's in me. I no longer confuse quietness with invisibility. Quiet can be observational. Quiet can be strategic. Quiet can be dominant in a way that doesn't require force. Dominance, I've learned, isn't about overpowering someone. It's about refusing to surrender authorship. My family no longer treats me as fragile, not because I proved I wasn't, but because I demonstrated that I would protect myself without theatrics. That unsettled them at first. Now it steadies the room. There's something powerful about being the person who doesn't shout, doesn't accuse, doesn't collapse, but also doesn't yield. I'm still a Dahlia, still observant, still detail-oriented, still the one who remembers what was said 2 years ago at a brunch table. The difference is this. I no longer try to be easy to manage. I try to be accurate. And accuracy has a weight that even consensus struggles to move. I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. And clarity is a very quiet kind of freedom. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that erasure rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with repetition. A word used lightly, a label applied casually, a tone interpreted consistently. Over time, those small descriptions harden into identity. And once identity is agreed upon by a group, it becomes dangerously efficient. Because consensus feels like truth. But consensus is not a diagnosis. Concern is not evidence. And calm disagreement is not instability. I didn't fight my family. I didn't expose them publicly. I didn't try to humiliate anyone or win. I did something quieter. I documented. I prepared. I positioned myself structurally before emotion could be weaponized. And that changed everything. The most unsettling part of this experience wasn't that my siblings discussed intervention. It was realizing how easy it is for a capable adult to be reframed if they don't protect their narrative early. You don't have to shout to be strong. You don't have to threaten to be taken seriously. And you don't have to wait for someone to act against you before you safeguard yourself. Sometimes justice looks like paperwork. Sometimes dominance looks like silence. And sometimes the most powerful sentence you can say is, I'm not spiraling, I'm clarifying. I still love my family. That didn't disappear. But love without boundaries becomes vulnerability. And boundaries without anger become authority. If you've ever been gently rewritten, if you've ever felt your calm mistaken for weakness, if you've ever noticed a narrative forming around you that didn't quite fit, I want you to know this. You are allowed to protect your authorship, quietly, legally, without spectacle. I'm curious, have you ever experienced a moment where you realized people were deciding who you were without your consent? And if so, how did you respond?